There we go. So I'd just like to say thank you so much to our panelists and attendees for joining us today. This should be a really interesting discussion. My name's Daniel. I'm the Director of Outreach with Insight Collaborative, and this is the second of our 2 webinars in June on the subject of technology in the humanitarian sector. Our first webinar was specifically around data and data protection as it pertains to migration. And today's webinar is about technology more broadly in the humanitarian space. We've got some great panelists with some very different backgrounds joining us today. So before I introduce them, I'll just say to our audience that you are very welcome to submit questions either in the chat or in the Q&A. And you're also welcome to submit those to me privately if you want to do so anonymously. And I will relay those questions to our panel at the right time. So I'll just start by saying a little bit about each of our panelists, and then we'll get started on the discussion. So our first panelist, I'm just going from left to right on my screen here, is Aral Shiramelli, who graduated from the Acıbadem University School of Medicine as an MD and from Harvard University T.H. Chan School of Public Health as an MPH. He's the co-founder and president of Medical Rescue Association of Turkey, or MEDAC, since 2013. He primarily works on medical rescue, disaster response, and the healthcare of migrant populations. The next person on my screen is Dr. Evelien Brewer, who is the senior researcher and lecturer at the Amsterdam Center for Migration and Refugee Law, and I'm really sorry if I get this pronunciation horribly wrong, but at the Vrije Universiteit of Amsterdam. Was that okay, or was that terrible?
No, pretty good.
Excellent. And her areas of expertise include migration and asylum law and the protection of fundamental rights, more specifically the right to effective legal remedies, non-discrimination and data protection. She was and is involved in different research projects addressing migration and asylum law, Schengen cooperation, and the use of EU large-scale databases and border technologies. And our final panelist is Lucas Hu. Lucas graduated from USC in 2020 with a BS in computer science and an MS in electrical engineering. While at USC, he founded the nation's first undergraduate student organization dedicated to using artificial intelligence for social good. He is now a data scientist at Palo Alto Networks, and he's the chief technical officer of Give Duet Inc., where he's able to continue using technology to improve the lives of others. In his free time, he enjoys listening to history podcasts and also cooks up some mean steak tips. Lucas, I'm vegetarian, so I can't get much from the steak tips, but I'd love to exchange history podcasts with you sometimes. So that is our. We'll leap straight into the discussion. The first question is, I'd like to ask each of you to introduce the way that you or your organization are using technology to address migration-related issues. Why don't we go in the same order that I introduced you in? So, Aral, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, sure. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. So, basically, the focus of my answers will be one of our projects called HERA, which we started under Medical Rescue Association, and then in 2019 it spun off to be a separate organization based in US. But basically, what we do through HERA is we try to connect the refugee populations, primarily working with Syrian refugees in Turkey with the available healthcare services. And we do this through an end user focused mobile application that the target populations, refugees themselves, can use in order to store their medical information, receive information about the existing health rights or even the COVID response, and also kind of through a behavioral intervention, reminders push the demand to meet the available services in prenatal care and vaccination services in Turkey. So that is how we kind of use technology, primarily by focusing on end users.
Thank you. Evelien, could we hear from you next, please?
Yes, of course, and thank you, Daniel, also for the invitation. I think I really will learn from you because I'm as a lawyer, I'm really from observation, the use of technologies, and especially in the field of European migration policies, which is more and more focused on the use of technologies instead of looking for a really long-term legal and safe migration path, or also solving problems in source countries. And there's really I wrote my PhD thesis in Nijmegen, which was on one database. So the storage of data on third country nationals, migrants in the Schengen information system. And there I focused on access to legal remedies. If you're in the system, how to get out, and if there are mistakes. But now we are about 10, 11 years later, and it is really amazing what kind. We have now 6 large-scale databases, including Eurodac, Visum Information System. And one of the issues is also the storage of biometrics in that system. So I have written on trying to keep up with the EU legislator on all the mechanisms which has been introduced and is also still on the agenda, also including now more sophisticated technologies, data surveillance, the use of big data, data analysis. And my focus has always been in my research, instead of also describing the developments also on the protection of human rights. So data protection, of course, privacy, of course, but also non-discrimination and again, access to data. So really data protection rights, but also legal remedies to ensure that when decisions are made to make migration decisions are made on the basis of those data, that you have possibility to refute the correctness or mistakes in that data. But I'm also, and I will say that later, also in the involvement of the humanitarian sides, I'm also focusing as a lawyer more on the problems than how it will help. But I'm really also very much interested in how to use technologies to help migrants.
I think that's a really good point, actually. I think some people here, their focus will be very much on the positives that technology can bring to migration, and others will be focused much more on the dangers or the negatives. And that's why it's really good to have such a varied panel with such different experiences. And how about you, Lucas?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So Give Duet Inc., or just Duet, we consider ourselves a tech nonprofit. So technology is very core to the way we work and has been a part of our core since day one. So essentially the goal is to allow donors from around the world to help provide refugees and migrants with the basic items they need to rebuild their lives. So it's a tech-based platform, and how it works is we have a network of partner stores in Greece where we currently operate. The refugee walks into the store and takes a picture of an item they need. They upload that picture through our Duet app, and that item then gets added to our website. And on our website, donors can go ahead and browse the various items that have been requested. They can make a donation online just as if they were shopping on Amazon. And when we receive a donation, we automatically send a bank transfer to the local store. So the payment goes to them, and the refugee and the store receive a pickup code. The refugee then walks back into the store, shows the store owner the pickup code on their mobile phone, and is able to receive the item. So technology really enables the connection, not just between us and the refugees, but also between the store owners and donors from all over the world, really. So I don't think something like this would have been possible like 10 years ago. So it's really fascinating to see how technology can enable these sorts of things.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that's maybe one of the reasons that it often feels like the NGO sector are very behind on technology. I think just because it moves so fast and because we have very limited resources. So it always feels like we're playing catch up, and all of the things that you guys over in California can have been using, you know, it feels like we might get there in a decade or two. So it's always good to have people from the cutting edge who are actually applying these solutions to humanitarian kind of issues. Thank you, everyone. So the next question is quite a broad one, I suppose, which is, in what ways can you envision the growing digitalization of data and security issues and technological issues impacting migrants in the humanitarian sector? And we'd love to hear both pros and cons here, because I think there's an awful lot of both, actually. I think there are both some huge benefits that technology can bring and also some very real dangers. So, so it'd be great to hear some of both. Aral, are you happy to start us off again?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, as you said, there are a lot of pros and cons, and it really depends on who you talk to, on which they'll bring up first. And I think one of the core ideas of the reason we do what we do the way we do is because we believe mobile populations need mobile solutions, because we've seen it, especially in healthcare, that a lot of the immobile systems that we had became useless pretty quickly. My country is neighbors with Syria, so when the waves of refugees started to come to Turkey, we focused or invested heavily in the cities that were neighboring with Syria, which made sense in the beginning, but then a lot of them had to move to other cities, obviously, to provide livelihoods to themselves. And that's where I think the digitalization of all of the interventions that we focus on plays a huge role in moving agile with the population. And for the data and security, when we kind of talk about the data, refugee data, and especially health data, it's extremely helpful in the field, because like everyone who has worked in the field knows, complete data is virtually impossible to get in humanitarian crises. And the way we kind of like to think about it, which as far as I know has been put out by an amazing person in Copenhagen University, is to use triangulation. So using different kind of data collection methods to come up with the best way of planning it. But digitalization allows and will probably allow more for us to kind of pinpoint the data details that we would like to have. And obviously it comes with the notion that it's a very, very sensitive data, in a sense that we like to collect it as researchers or as healthcare professionals. We like the more detailed data, the better for us. But also it becomes an issue that it can be used for other purposes by other groups that you work with. And there always is a discussion how much or when to share data. But as nonprofits, we are there to assist. We should technically be assisting, not doing the whole thing. The countries or the more robust organizations should be doing it. But it's always a problem, right? You want the healthcare provider to provide, and they're saying, well, we need the data you have in order to do that. But it's usually, not usually, but potentially an issue if you work with governments, that those data can end up in very, very risky situations. So it's always a discussion, and we always discuss it with our partners when talking about it, or how we're going to use it, who we're going to share, who we're not going to share. And also there is the issue of local laws and regulations, right? Whatever humanitarian principle you want to put forth, if you're working in a country, it ends up being about their laws. Like I know in Turkey, technically Ministry of Health owns all the data. So there is technically no way to keep data from them. And what organizations end up doing is just not collect data on the things that might be risky. That's a solution that some organizations like Médecins du Monde use. But it's also an issue. Again, they should be the ones providing the healthcare, and then, well, they need data for that. So I think it's always a discussion that I do not have a definite answer for, but it's I think gonna become more important. And one last thing that I want to mention here is VR, and I know a lot of nonprofits are looking in the ways of using distributed networks or blockchain technologies to ensure that the end user, the target populations, are the ones making that decision to share the data or not, which is the core of the discussion, right? It should be their decision, not ours or not the providers on that. But it certainly needs to progress a lot more than what it is right now.
I think that's a really good point, and there are a lot, aren't there, of I would argue that the majority of countries have at least some worrying trends with kind of data control and data misuse. And sometimes that can be down to malicious intent. Sometimes it can even be down to simple digital mistakes. You know, I think there are a lot of governments which are maybe not very digitally au fait and which make some very disappointing errors and data breaches. So yeah, I think you're right. I think both in terms of worrying levels of desire for control and also just worrying digital incompetence, there are some very worrying trends in a lot of countries. What do you both think about that? Sorry, before we kind of go on to the more general thing, Luca, Civilian, I'd love to hear from you on kind of data protection and how NGOs can function safely in that space.
Yeah, I think so. First of all, RL brings up a lot of really good points there. There's a lot of different directions to explore. I guess specifically on data privacy, since my full-time job is in cybersecurity, this is something we think about a lot, is what information should you even be storing in the first place? One example of this was with Duet, we decided not to store the refugees' addresses. One original idea was possibly to deliver the goods to their door as opposed to using the in-store pickup. We decided, having us manage that database of addresses maybe wouldn't be the best idea, especially for such a sensitive group. So that is like a conscious design decision we made from the beginning. And if you think about it, we ourselves, everyday people, already trade our data for goods and services all the time. Like Facebook, for example, social media, you are trading your own information for a free service. And if you think about that in the migrant space, that does happen as well. They will have to give up certain pieces of information in order to receive protection. And I guess the consequences of that are magnified by a huge amount when you're working with these groups. Another thing we're seeing specifically as it relates to cybersecurity is when a hacker gets access to one of these databases, instead of just locking the system up or using what's known as ransomware to take your files, they're now doing what's called data exfiltration, where they'll say, if you don't pay us this ransom, we will release this data out into the public. And this is something we're seeing a lot with hospitals already. So it's not like these hackers have many moral qualms about who exactly they're attacking. If they were to target the nonprofit space, I think that would be a really big issue. So, there are many, many pros to having this data, but at the same time, you really have to be careful about what you're storing. And I guess as a broad rule, the less you store, the better, unless you have a specific use case for something. Because if you're storing it, that means it can be breached, and there are consequences for that. So that's always something to think about.
Yeah, I very much agree with both Iril and Lucas. There are downs and upsides, but I don't want to sound like a Cassandra, but I'm more concerned about the downsides, because opportunities from technologies will empower national authorities, member states, to use them in the way they want. And unfortunately, we live in a time that not only like countries in the EU, but also Australia, US, they like to control their borders, and they're not very open for protecting refugees, migrants in need, and even for labor migrants those countries need. It's quite hard to get in the country. So you see that I'm more a specialist at the EU level, that you see generally the technologies are used for this restrictive approach. But also in other countries, it's not only about controlling borders, also in restricted countries where the human rights are violated of minorities, we see that tools which have been developed for helping refugees, for example, I'm thinking at the Rohingya in Myanmar and India. There has been a report in November 2020, it's called Locked In and Locked Out, from an organization on statelessness and inclusion. And they show how this information system, I think developed by UNHCR to ensure that refugees in those areas, so refugees from the Rohingya community, would be able to get food and shelter by registering them, also using biometrics, how this registration is misused by the authorities to keep them in those areas and to take rights from them. So I'm quite concerned, and you see the same. Another example is the development of Eurodac. It's one of the oldest large-scale databases in Europe. Millions and millions of asylum seekers are recorded with biometrics in this database. It was only meant, and that's you say you should restore as less as possible personal information. I agree with you, Lucas. And this is an example where this database was only meant for registration number and the fingerprints, so to see in which country you could lodge an asylum application. Now in 2021, we have a Eurodac, which will stores already more information, but there's a law adopted. It will store personal information, facial images, the name of family members, the country of origin where you come from, and personal information, giving a vague circumscription of details on the person itself. That can be everything, and also whether you are considered as a dangerous person. A security risk will also be included in Eurodac. In 2015, we already allowed law enforcement authorities access to this data for asylum seekers, which is really problematic. And this brings me to a final point. And in the third round, I have other points I want to raise. But here I also want to stress, of course, in humanitarian zone, when you provide data to NGOs or UNHCR, you suppose you're, as a migrant, you think I will give it because I will be helped. I get food, I get shelter. When you're submitting your personal data to the authorities, the border control authorities, the border agencies, you're providing your data also because you think you will get asylum. It's the only way. So there's no really voluntary aspect. Otherwise, then we will give our data to the municipality, for example. There's a more voluntary approach. And there you have a really problem because it's not only about personal data, it's also, for example, to undergo medical examination and use technologies to assess whether you're a minor or an adult, or giving DNA to show whether you're really a family member of somebody who is in another country. So I would like to stress the different relationship between a migrant and the host state, or the state where he or she intends to go to, and his own state, also with regard to the democratic possibilities to influence the huge impact those technologies will have and can be used for example, law enforcement, but also even sharing with third states like your own home country. That's also quite a problematic issue. So yes, there's it can start like something, the technologies to help or to just administer your migration system. That's of course, normally we need the data of people asking for a residence permit or asylum protection. But over the years, I have seen that all those databases extended their purposes, it's shared with different authorities, and it's huge. Not only the number of individuals in the data systems and the authorities using those databases, but also the more specific personal information stored in those databases. And that's, yeah, concerning, because as you say correctly, it can be mistakes, there can be, one authority will make an interpretation of, okay, crime that's very dangerous, or no, you need to have a drugs crime to be considered dangerous for or national standards. So there's really a lot of differentiating when more authorities and states are involved. So that's for now.
One small thing to add might be, actually two small things. One is, in our research, to Lucas's point about like sharing your data for goods and services, we found that the primary way to get healthcare information about their rights and everything of the refugees was using Facebook or WhatsApp, which is owned by Facebook. Just wanted to add it there. The other one is there's also a danger of misinterpretation of data, because when you have that much sensitive data, if the people who are evaluating or analyzing it is, I don't want to say not professional, but also not careful about how to interpret that data, it can, and it does lead to a lot of xenophobia and everything with the crime statistics and everything. We saw it with tuberculosis or other infectious diseases that the supposedly refugees are bringing to the country, while the actuality was they were actually getting more tuberculosis in Turkey because of unsafe and unhygienic living conditions where they live. So it's also another kind of issue with, even if you can ensure that data is not used for malicious purposes, it can be interpreted in a very, very, very bad way.
Absolutely. And I think, unfortunately, that is something that's probably common to much of the world, that generally speaking, refugees and asylum seekers tend to get given by far the worst accommodation, and that does cause very severe health issues. That is certainly the case in the UK. We've seen a lot of cases of people being given accommodation that's just absolutely dreadful, you know, black mold on the walls, infested with roaches, just a really horrible and very unhealthy environment to live in.
Maybe if I could add also, because this medical information, it was when Errol mentioned it, this is of course your topic, so maybe you can stress this. But what we've seen in, for example, the Netherlands, in a detention center, it's years ago, but it was a quite huge incident which caused a lot of proposals, and also the European Parliament insisting for improvement, that indeed not sharing medical information when it's necessary can cause harm. And here it was a psychiatric patient. He was really suicidal. He was depressed, and he committed suicide when he was detained by the immigration authorities. And there, the conclusion was, after investigation, that the doctors, nurses, the staff of the detention center, they knew that the person was depressed, but they didn't share the information in the right time with each other. So there was really a lack of connection, or a lack of sharing of data. And we see that also in the youth. It's not only a migration problem. In the Netherlands, we see that also in the youth organization. So really, youngsters in problems. And my concern is that we stress on sharing and using data surveillance tools and large databases and central storage of information. But when it is necessary, for example, also the terrorist attacks, the cooperation between EU states, where it was every time when there was a terrorist attack, the message afterwards was, well, yes, the Belgian police knew there was a dangerous person going around in France, or vice versa. And that's a little bit my concern. It's also sort of window dressing what we are doing. We say, okay, we have databases, we have systems to help humanitarian, or to give humanitarian aid, but when it's really necessary, you don't train our officials to share information when it's really necessary for security purposes or for helping and ensuring the health and safety of migrants at stake. And there's really this problematic focus on, well, let's show that we have technologies instead of using them when it's necessary.
Yeah, I think that's very true.
That when you, because you are really, Lucas and Aral, really developing tools and trying to have those tools used, but do you see also, well, now it's also the politicians or the legislator to take it up? Are you also looking how, yeah, it is ensured that with safeguards and also the hack problem, for example, that security standards are respected? Are you also in touch with the legislator or politicians with your work? It's a question to you.
Sure, I'll go quickly. So we haven't been in touch with regarding that specifically, but we do internally try to adhere to a lot of security best practices. A lot of these are really straightforward and they can help protect a lot of data from getting into the wrong hands. Just really simple things like using strong passwords, enabling two-factor authentication so that even if someone does have your password, they can't get into your account. So we do take those practices very seriously. And I guess I also want to try to touch on the blockchain point a bit later. I don't know how deep we want to get down that rabbit hole just because it is such a new technology, but I am very fascinated to see whether legislators and whether governments will be willing to adopt something like that in the future. But that's probably a separate discussion, and I hand it off to Aral now.
Yeah, so in our case, we kind of have to work with the at some point with the Ministry of Health and the local health authorities, and we do kind of work with Istanbul in Istanbul with the health authorities on not just the security and of the data, but also how our system can talk to their system, because at the end, what we come up with has to be scalable and integrable, because the idea is, again, connecting the demand with the supply. So the supplier needs to be able to talk to what we are doing to a point, and at that point, with the legislators, politicians, or the ministerial health authorities are the one of the cornerstone of anything we do if we want to have an impact in the field.
That's really interesting. I mean, it sounds like there's a lot more negatives being mentioned than positives so far, and I wonder if that's because we sometimes tend to focus more on our worries, and we almost assimilate the positives in our lives much more easily. And just to avoid the discussion becoming all doom and gloom, I'd love to hear from all of you about some of the positives that technology has brought to the humanitarian sector at large, and migration in particular.
I can. Oh, Lucas, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, so one, I guess very broadly, technology enables connectivity. And I think with the migrant sector especially, that's such a big plus. So for example, sending remittances used to be very, very difficult. There are now services that exist that have fees that are far reduced from what they used to be. We use a service called TransferWise to send our bank transfers to stores in Greece. I think it's becoming increasingly popular to use services like this. And in general, the ability to connect, I guess for our organization, to share the stories of the people we're working with has been so tremendous. Like, we're able to connect with people halfway across the world via Facebook Messenger, via whatever other communication platform, and to tell these stories of migrants on our website. And that really helps build up empathy, and it shows people hear at home that these are real people and they just happen to be in some pretty tough circumstances. You know, I think that that type of storytelling was possible in the past, but you couldn't get it for every single individual or every single family. What technology has allowed us to do is to tell that unique story for every family on our website and for every family that we work with. And I think that's very powerful. You know, social media does have its cons, but it really can enable these powerful connections when it's used properly. And that has been very tremendous. Like the ability to have a truly global community is something that was not possible. And now it is, but it also requires that we think about these things in the right way and we try to prevent these negatives while focusing on those positives. But for us as an organization, it's been huge.
Yeah, I was one of the points I was going to mention. So Lucas put it very good. But just to add to his point about connectivity, this is also a great way for them to connect with their families too. So the connectivity, and we always used to discuss it with donors or potential partners. They're like, well, do they even have phones or do they need phones? And I think it was MSF who put it the best. It was mobile phones are not a luxury, but a need for the population because connectivity is a huge part of not just mental health, mental well-being, but everything they do. So it became a tremendous tool for them, but also it also helped us to bear witness to what exactly has been going on in the field, because I think that's happening in a refugee camp right now can be broadcasted to people in other countries very easily through just like taking photos or videos, and it's instant, which is great. So I think the pros on that side are extremely important. And I just wanted to give a sort of example of using digital kind of tools that we did during the pandemic. Was basically we just started doing symptom surveillance for the user base that we're working with. So asking them every 2 weeks about their symptoms, whether they know where to go and everything. And it took us like 5-10 minutes to implement that into the program. And again, I'm not technical like at all, but it was without the need of technical people or knowledge that we were able to implement that. And it's a very small example, but it would cost a lot of time and money in order to do that to a large user base. It's a very simple use of connectivity that enabled us to see the levels of COVID-19 infections in our population. So these are kind of great potentials that digital tools allow us to implement.
Yeah, not to be only Cassandra, I agree with you that, of course, use of technologies and especially social media and the use of smartphone is a lifesaver for many migrants. The connection with NGOs, rescue organizations at sea, but also finding itinerary to a safer area is, of course, only possible or more possible with the use of smartphone and social media. Also with data storage, the reunion of migrants with family members elsewhere in the world is also made possible by, of course, registration, and could be made possible by that. And on a more sad example, but also very important for relatives of border vets or people who didn't survive their journey to Europe or other places. It's also quite it has been made possible by registration. For example, Red Cross. I know Red Cross was for years. I'm not completely sure how they managed to do it, but because of privacy considerations, they refused to register border deaths, as for example at the Italian coast when they were found the bodies and buried in graveyards. They refused to make a registration, but of course Red Cross is quite important by connecting relatives, people who stayed behind, with sadly people who didn't survive. But that's really important for the relatives to know where their family members are or stayed. With regard to the social media, I just wanted to add, because I'm curious whether you are aware of this use, but at the EU level, policymakers are now also preparing, and you can see that as a positive or a negative goal, to influence by using big data, by using algorithms and the use of social media to especially address youngsters and influence the social media images, information they get by providing them information. Don't come to Europe. It's not safe in Europe, or it is not safe to try to find and to cross the desert or Turkey or the Spanish borders and to come to Europe. You will not survive. So there's a quite sophisticated new use coming ahead. It's not, I'm not sure whether some countries are already using it, but it's also at the policy agenda from the EU legislator to also use social media to influence, to push, to give push information in the sense of discouraging people to come. And you could say, okay, when that saves lives, also it's positive, but of course it's a quite, for privacy or freedom of information level considered, it's quite problematic maybe that governments are really forming or shaping the information that people will get using social media. So that's also really a new development taking place here when we're talking about border technologies or artificial intelligence. I don't know if you are aware of that use.
No, I wasn't, but I can't say I'm entirely surprised by it. I think, these technologies are changing much faster than governments can adapt. So the chances that you'll be able to legislate around something like this, especially in like the first initial years of its use, I mean, it seems to be very low. So, I've seen also algorithms used for good purposes as well, just to kind of turn the table a little bit. So I'm aware of some projects regarding homelessness in Los Angeles, where they've been able to essentially predict who is going to be most successful in a housing or relocation program, so that these apartments will have the maximum occupancy. And I think they've been able to use that pretty successfully. Targeted ads, though, I think is something that we're going to have to see how it plays out over the next couple of years. I know some legislation is starting to pop up around it, and it seems like companies are starting to take it into their own hands because the governments aren't able to keep up. So, for example, Apple is the company that's kind of been at the cutting edge with respect to these different privacy concerns. So I don't know if it's going to be resolved at all over the next couple of years, or if individuals are going to have to take things into their own hands and adopt technologies that, for example, prevent personalized ads and prevent these sorts of trackers. But hopefully over the next few years, we'll start to converge on a few best practices surrounding that. But I'm sure by the time we get there, there'll be some new technologies popping up that we'll then have to think about. So I'm not entirely surprised by that creative, quote unquote, use of personalized ads.
No, nor am I. And it was only a few years ago now that the British government went with significantly more analog technology by sending 2 vans around London telling undocumented migrants to go home.
Yeah.
So this is unfortunately something that governments have done before, and personally I see it as a very worrying trend because fundamentally by international law people have the right to claim asylum, and trying to tell people, oh no, you shouldn't come here because it's not safe, is frankly drastically misrepresenting the situation. By and large, Europe is safe, and where a case could be made that it isn't safe for someone to come to Europe, then that's largely because of the actions of border agencies with pushbacks and persecution, and detention centres. So yes, personally, I see that as a very negative development, although like Lucas, I'm not at all surprised that it's a development that is happening. But broadly speaking, those are all very positive developments. So thank you all very much for those. I was quite keen to get some kind of positive aspects or effects of technology on migration and humanitarian sector, because I have an inkling the next question may be slightly less positive, which is, what do grassroots level organizations need to consider when it comes to the future trajectory of kind of technology and digitalization in the humanitarian and the migration space?
I can start us off with that if you don't mind. So one thing that we experienced, and we see a lot of even large scale nonprofits experience, is that until now, the human resources or the overall resources of organizations did not really focus on having technical expertise. And the usual way of receiving those services was to work with external companies, like something that we did too with just buying a mobile or having an external app development company do our work for us, which normally works. But the issue is that with humanitarian organizations, what you have to plan out or work in the field needs to be adjusted for the population you work, which ends up usually being very different than the normal use cases of mobile applications. And it plays out very different when you work with refugees. And it seems that, in my experience, the nonprofits and the tech companies do have a kind of lack of being able to communicate with each other, in that one has the experience from the field and one has the technical experience. And when they try to work together, there are a lot of issues because both of them bring different sets of experience, and they do kind of end up not being able to talk to each other very well. And in that sense, I would think that for grassroots organizations, having the technical expertise, at least starting out with it internally, makes a lot of sense. And again, I'm speaking from experience, spending a lot of time and energy on useless discussions, just not because the companies that we were talking with were not good at their jobs, but because what we were saying, they weren't able to understand, and 100% what they were saying, I wasn't able to understand. So there's a huge miscommunication between the two kind of expertise. And for grassroots organizations, I would definitely suggest kind of getting that experience in-house or creating that experience in-house in order to implement technological tools in the field. Because again, humanitarian work is very inexperienced in this intervention tools.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think what brings me hope is there are more and more recent graduates now who are interested in using technology for social good. So I've seen, even just in the last few years, so many more university programs oriented around that. And I think that is really promising. At the same time, it's been very interesting for me, given that my degree is in computer science in a very technical field, and now trying to apply those skills in the real world and seeing that the major issues aren't necessarily the technical ones. It's things like the language barrier. it's dealing with digital privacy and things that they really don't teach you in those university classes. So for our engineering team, there have been so many things we've had to learn just from experience. And I think that's where having that in-house talent can really help. I also think there are a lot of technical people who want to help. If you're able to find some volunteers who are willing to give up some free time and either in a consulting role or perhaps in like a part-time volunteer role, contribute to your organization, I think it's really worth exploring those avenues and trying to see if there are people who can help your organization in that way. I've been very pleasantly surprised by the number of applicants we get, even for unpaid volunteer roles in technical positions. And I think it's really great to see. And I hope there is more and more collaboration and intersection between these two fields in the future. And I think it starts from the university level. And I think we're seeing more and more of it. So in a few years, hopefully, Aral, you have less of a communication gap between the technology sector.
Yeah, just I failed miserably by just watching YouTube videos of how to write in React Native. It's just not working.
If I can add 3 points, I completely agree with bridging the gap between the specialists and the policymakers, but also the lawyers. And I remember a colleague of mine, it was really more post 9/11 when it really started for security purposes, also where can we use technologies, that there was a general big conference on the use of algorithms for decision making. And she was surprised that there was only technicians, technologists, and no lawyer except for herself then. So I think that was, that is quite important. And I would have 3, if grassroots organizations or NGOs, private organizations develop these tools to help migrants to get humanitarian aid where it's necessary, I think it's important to always, and that's also what Lucas said, to think what do you need and what is not necessary. So really data minimization, only store data or provide technologies who are only there for exactly that goal you need. And there's the role of lawyers, ensure that it's really clear and transparent. Also, when you are really in direct contact with migrants, if migrants are submitting data or allowing the use of technologies, also for sharing information, money, like the remittances and the blockchain technologies is quite interesting, but be sure that the migrant, the person about who we are talking here today, knows why and what are the purposes and what are the possibilities of those technologies, that it's really clear for which purpose and what kind of use is possible. Second, I would advise to be sure, always be aware that when using these technologies or developing or storing data, for example, medical data, or what has been bought by a person with this interesting program, Lucas, you refer to, by what you buy in the stores can possibly sometimes be very sensitive data. For example, halal food, what kind of ethnicity are you from? Be aware that if you are in a legal in a state, that state has the power, also repressive state, also authoritarian state, in their criminal law saying, well, we need this data now for law enforcement purposes. We have a criminal investigation. You are in our state, you are obliged to provide us this data, subpoena measure. I think that every organization should be aware when collecting or using technologies that the guest state has, under conditions, maybe with a judge ordering you to give the information, but it is possible because you're in the legal situation of that state. And finally, I'm quite interested in tools and developing technological tools which give the person the right to control on the information. And I think we are lacking I know there have been initiatives. I know there's work going on there, but I think giving the person control on the data, that can be the passport and information which is stored on that passport, but also smartphone, and really the power not to give information on that on smartphone to the border authorities, but also the tools you are referring to, medical information, very important. You are the one who decides what to share and what not. And of course, when law enforcement is at stake, then there's a bigger power of national authorities. But the right to control and the possibility to control of the data holder or the individual, I think that is quite important for future concentration or development of all of us, lawyers and IT developers. Thanks.
It really feels like one of the major themes coming out of this discussion is around connection, in terms of the benefits of technology being largely connection-based, but also in terms of the importance of connection and collaboration between different sectors and departments, you know, between tech and medicine and law and NGOs and many other groups as well, in trying to ensure the best use of technology for the humanitarian sectors, but also on a kind of smaller scale, connection between individuals and agencies around given cases or concerns. So, for example, the concerns that you raised earlier around health officials simply not, flagging up the fact that someone might, for example, be at a risk of suicide. So it really feels like there's a very strong theme of connection and collaboration coming through here. And that was something I was thinking earlier as well, is that is another major benefit that technology has brought to the sector, is that it allows us to gather experts in different fields from all over the world to discuss these topics for an audience of people from all over the world. And that has been really lovely as well. Do any of you have any kind of last thoughts that you would like to share?
Yeah, maybe just to get back in my role of Cassandra again, I would like to focus, and I think that's important, the work of all disciplines, to focus on the positive and the added value of technologies. But sadly, what I see at the legislation in Europe, but also United States, but I'm now focused at the EU level, is quite restrictive. So when you talk about sharing, the EU legislator is thinking about sharing with law enforcement authorities, with Europol, sharing with third countries, which is really dangerous if you are coming as a refugee, and then the state of immigration is sharing your information back again with your country of origin for the purpose of returning you, possibly. So it's quite, I'm not very positive about the future development. There's even a legislation on artificial intelligence presented this year by the European Commission, which allows again the use of lie detectors. And really saying, both in the field of law enforcement, but both in the field of migration control, the use of polygraphs. So really to test the emotional state of a natural person. I'm now quoting the legal proposal of the European Commission. So in the heads of the politicians, and again, we are in a very restrictive environment and time, it is more, okay, how can we use those technologies to keep the others out? And that is, I'm really concerned about those developments, and I hope, also from humanitarian organizations and technological developers, it's quite important to keep that in mind, that the wrong use is more, on the heads of the legislation at this moment. Or wrong, that's maybe too exaggerated, but restriction is more higher at the policy agenda.
Thank you.
I can go next. I think, that is unfortunate to hear. At the same time, I do think any potential solutions are going to require a lot more crosstalk and collaboration between private companies in the technology field, governments, other agencies, etc. So I just really want to encourage that moving forward. I think it's a hopeful trend that there is going to be a bit more collaboration. But I think any solutions to those issues you mentioned, Evelyn, are really going to require that over the next few years and decades.
Thank you. Is there anything you'd like to share, Haral, before we sign off?
Yeah, one small thing I think very important that we when we think about the refugees or other vulnerable populations is that the way I see, or another dimension of digital technologies, is that it is, I think, is a great way to bring more focus on empowerment of the population themselves rather than just tools. And I like the idea, or the way I see it is that it's a bit contradictory to the classic notion of helper and helpee, focusing more on the population themselves and empowering them to make the decisions. And it goes back to the point of Evelyn, that the interventions or programs that we design not just have to be user-centric, but also allow for them to make the decision, not only sharing data, but also in the services that they acquire. A brief example is I was in a meeting with IFRC a couple years ago, and we literally discussed about whether the Syrian refugees in Turkey can buy alcohol with the cash transfers that we give them, and whether it is okay and everything. And it kind of comes to the point of don't you think they should be the ones making that decision? And so I like the idea and firmly believe that digital technologies will allow us to shift the focus from helper and helpee to a more user-centered approach to the crises around the world and the humanitarian work that we do.
Yeah, big +1 to that. At Duet, that was one of the major reasons we wanted to allow the refugees themselves to go request the items, instead of us from halfway across the world saying, here, we're gonna give you some shoes or jackets because we think that's what you need. So really, I do think technology can be used to give these users their own autonomy as well.
Absolutely, and that kind of autonomy and empowerment is incredibly important in all aspects of humanitarian work, really, and it's something that the sector is very gradually getting better at, but I think it's a long road and there's still a lot of work to do there. Okay, well, thank you all so much. This has been a really interesting discussion, and thank you to our attendees for joining us for this discussion. We will be uploading the video to YouTube fairly soon, or to our YouTube channel. And do keep an eye on our social media as well. In July, we'll be having 2 webinars on the subject of pushbacks and the criminalization of humanitarians. So some really important recent trends in migration. So do keep an eye on our social media for the link to register for that. And I'd just like to finish again with a huge thanks to all 3 of our panelists. You've been amazing. And I really hope we can have another discussion soon.
Thank you, Daniel.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you all.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Bye.